Hi, and welcome back to Week 9 lecture here in the Anthropology of Music and Sound. As usual, we'll go through a number of the readings and concepts we'll be looking at during the week, additional media, and I'll also focus on demos and other contexts of sound and music as appropriate with this week's focus. So for Week 9 ideas, we'll focus on music and sound in a variety of different social settings, including focus on performance and context of performance. We'll look at music as a text, which refers to music as either a text in the sense of it being lyrics on a page that often get expressed along with the music, as well as that sonic exploration of music that itself can be seen in some very interesting textual senses. We'll also talk about music plus, and by this I mean music beyond audio, music or oral context itself, looking at music as film, music and multimedia, spoken word and performance, theater, and numerous other contexts that we'll talk about this week. So to go through some of the concepts of music in social settings, we'll talk this week about medical ethnomusicology, how music can be used in many therapeutic senses, in ways that contrast with what we talked about last week, where music was used in displeasurable senses in terms of music as torture. We'll talk about sound music, religion, and altered states of consciousness that may connect to music. We might talk about EDM and dubstep and the context of how music can affect us in physiological senses, even creating altered states of consciousness. Think about the pounding of bass that you might experience in a club or at a rave and how that impacts your body and your sense of physiology as well as your mind and your psychology. We'll talk about the communal nature of the concert as well as other contexts of performance and how we can look at performance in the sense of understanding its connection to musical settings and beyond. Now, when we talk about music as a text, we might look at the symbolic properties of music in various senses. We can also look at the semiotics of music or how symbols emerge in musical contexts. We'll talk about musical structure and form, poetry and musical text, and sound and social structure. So I thought a really great opportunity this week to talk about music as a text would actually happen here through a discussion of the musical Hamilton. I just had a chance to see Hamilton in the Broadway Comes to Reno series, and I was absolutely blown away. And I think a lot of you have heard about Hamilton, all the awards it's won, from Pulitzer Prize to record for number of Tony nominations and wins and so forth. Part of the team, of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda, famous for In the Heights, and really someone, along with his collaborators, who has really pushed the envelope in terms of the musical here in the United States and really around the world. So what I found amazing about Hamilton was how textual it was. And by textual, I mean it's based upon a famous biography by Ron Chernow, a biography on Alexander Hamilton. And if you get a chance to read the rich history of Hamilton, you can find out about it online. But it's really interesting to think that Lin-Manuel Miranda took this text and then reworked it as a musical. So obviously you have a literal text that people read for pleasure, that people read that had no musical context to it. He takes it, he adapts it, then he remakes it, if you will, for Broadway, for off-Broadway, for the musical theatrical stage. So I think what's really great about theater, what's really great about musicals is the fact that you can have these incredible adaptations of texts that probably when reading them, no one really thought of as a musical text. So that level of connection between the literal text and the musical text that's created in this musical, I think is really phenomenal and something for us to think about. The other thing that is really interesting that just blew me away, and again, I would just say if you get a chance to hear Hamilton, you can actually go online. There's wonderful videos. They did a whole tour at the White House with the original cast. This was not the original cast. It's going into quite a few years here of production and a national tour. But the original cast did a special performance at the White House, so you can watch some of that performance. You could also go online and look at the Disney film version of it, which was a recording of one of the Broadway performances, and so many other videos that people have shared online. What's interesting about Hamilton from the fandom perspective is that so many people have gotten involved that apps have sprung out such that people have started to collect stories and do their own tales and versions, not unlike what we saw in pop culture years ago with Star Trek, and how people said, I can provide my own voice as an author writing about the characters in Star Trek from my own perspective. So the fandom that's been generated with Hamilton is really incredible. Now, there's been an interesting social class dimension, and in fact, when Obama introduces the cast at the White House to give that performance years back, he mentions the fact about how expensive it is, and there's kind of an ongoing joke about, even the Obamas couldn't afford to go to Hamilton, which is, of course, not true, but it is definitely a phenomenon, and that also relates to then ticket prices and people not being able to afford attending the musical. In our case, my wife and I were able to go for about $100 a piece by buying the season tickets. It's still expensive, but I think for what you get, it's a pretty good deal, just in my opinion. People will pay $600, $700, $800 for a U2 concert. So that's a phenomenon I think also worth talking about as we consider some of these issues of fandom and sort of the social class politics of performance and music. So that issue, I think, is one that needs to be addressed. And I know that the cast of Hamilton did a number of performances for local schools when they did their White House visit. So that's certainly a great opportunity to give back to the community, to people maybe who couldn't afford to normally see it. But it's something definitely to consider when you look at a cultural phenomenon like Hamilton. Now, the issue for me that was really interesting, as I was looking at the credits after the first act, and there's so many, it's a very long program, but I started to look at this section here that said the score of Hamilton contains references to the following classics. And there's a ton of songs and other musicals not written by Lin-Manuel Miranda listed here. And that list goes on all the way into the next page here. And then there's also a listing here of someone working as a music clearance individual. So I was kind of blown away by this. And there were moments in the musical where I thought, oh, that sounds familiar, that melody and so forth. So when I got home, I started to research. And I love musicals, I love Broadway. I'm not certainly someone who knows a lot of lore or history about this form. But I started to look this up, and as you can see here, I posted this on my Facebook account. I said I loved all of Hamilton's allusions and intertextual moments. So an allusion refers to referencing something else or giving, some reference maybe to something that happened in the past. It could also be something in a story that's going to happen in the future, where it's like foreshadowing. So allusions are kind of interesting. I like calling these intertextual moments. And intertextuality refers to this idea that a text will refer to another text. So the texts are like interconnected almost. So someone came up with this, and they found all the theater references in Hamilton. I won't go through this with you, but it's a very good, well done video. And the person's making the point that there are lines, there are moments, there are exact references picked from another musical and plopped into this musical. So it could be West Side Story. It could be Stephen Sondheim, one of his many musicals, theatrical hits. And what I find interesting about that is Lin-Manuel Miranda and the others involved here are making linkages to various levels, not just of American history with the text of Hamilton, but also to theatrical history and Broadway musical history. So you have song references. You have kind of the borrowing and adapting that we hear in a lot of hip hop and rap music. So there's that level of referencing as well musically. And of course, a lot of the genre in Hamilton focuses on hip hop, rap, and R&B genres, as well as we'll get to here, classic rock with the Beatles, with the King character and his specific You'll Be Back song that is, I think, for me, one of the great moments of this musical. So these theatrical references also include reference to famous plays. So there's reference to Macbeth, and there's a whole thing in theater about not uttering Macbeth in the theater. And at first they say a certain Scottish theatrical piece, and then later the character does say Macbeth. And kind of the joke there, the allusion, if you will, is the idea, just like in Macbeth, Alexander Hamilton, after that utterance, doesn't bode very well, and his life goes downhill. He loses his son in a duel. He has, marriage relationship issues. He has more trials and tribulations with the political aspects of the Founding Fathers. And then he also, of course, loses his life in a duel to Aaron Burr. And so that level of intertextuality, musically, theatrically, lines from plays and other musicals and actual musical motifs, all that intermixing and remixing, as we've talked about in previous weeks of this class, for me provided for such a rich performance experience. I wasn't quite expecting that. I was expecting amazing music and dancing and performance and acting, and it blew me away. I'm always saying after watching a performance like this, how in the world can people be so perfect in their delivery of lines, their singing, the memorization of all the text, the dancing, all the staging and acting and cues they have to do. It's just absolutely phenomenal to think about this level of virtuosity and perfection. And of course, these are the best performers in the world, but I'm always just blown away by that because all of us have been in performances and have made mistakes. And literally when we watch a performance and you can't pick up on any notable mistakes, it's just absolutely phenomenal from a performance standpoint. So that level of virtuosity, the brilliance of the music, I can't say enough about how amazing Hamilton is, but what I wasn't expecting was that level of intertextuality and complexity that comes out through this text that they're creating. Again, we can look at textual moments, literal textual moments, lines, or even musical ones that could be verses or specific melodies, and talk about those connections that Lin-Manuel Miranda and the others involved in Hamilton were making. And the interesting thing is this song by the King, who's a great character, is also very iconic, and this particular article is about how the Beatles specifically inspired that song in terms of the verse, in terms of even some of the lyrics. As they mention here, Hamilton is the greatest phenomenon Broadway has seen. Its combination of rap, R&B, humor, drama, and history got many people interested in the founding of the United States. And to craft the musical, Lin-Manuel Miranda took influence from a variety of artists, including the Beatles. So again, that level of taking these other texts and styles and genres, as we've been talking about in previous weeks, and intertwining them in this very complex text. So complex that arguably there are a lot of references, allusions, intertextual moments that we don't note. And that's what I think makes a piece of art so amazing. It goes back to that idea of the open work that Umberto Eco talked about in terms of the audience can bring interpretation and understanding to the text that they're saying. And arguably in any musical performance, we all see something different and we're inspired by something different. There's also a whole line of influence that you can read about from the world of classical music, even Wagner. And, Wagner operas still continue to get staged to this day. And certainly opera is another genre that we have to reference here and consider in the relationship, say, with the musical, the Broadway musicals. So I just found that Hamilton was such a complex text in terms of, again, those influences that I was just discussing, and that issue of the adaptation, taking the original book about Hamilton and adapting it for this musical audience. The other thing that I think is interesting is getting people interested in the history of the Founding Fathers, and one of the great moments of watching this entire performance is this idea that Lin-Manuel Miranda has suggested, that really this is a version of our early history as a country as told through contemporary non-white people, people who were not included, unfortunately, in the vision of the Founding Fathers. And so that's the other side of this that makes it so fascinating. The fact that the cast is not an all-white cast, the fact that we don't have whitewashing, as we see in a lot of other media forms, makes this as well revolutionary. So when you're watching an African-American or a Latinx man playing Alexander Hamilton, you get an entirely different take on U.S. history. And so it's also this very postmodern text that's taking a historical legacy and making it appropriate, reinterpreting it for a new audience that is more multicultural and more influenced by sort of non-white art forms and non-Eurocentric art forms. And that infusion of rap, R&B, hip-hop is another side of this, where you see the rap battles between Burr and Hamilton, and you think, like, this is a totally brilliant reinterpretation of American history. Of course, that didn't really happen, per se, back in the day. But now giving it this new vision, revisioning it, or remaking it rather, as a rap battle says something entirely different about the trajectory of this country and some of those visions that the Founding Fathers had and now have resulted in new opportunities. And so connecting to our discussions of politics and race from last week, There's also so much to say about Hamilton in terms of the politics of American history. We looked at Childish Gambino, This is America, another great text to really interrogate the white supremacist history of the United States. There's also gender issues. I think the fact that women have predominant roles and they're seen as the wife of Hamilton, for example, setting up, I think it was a halfway house or a house for the needy or for orphans. I forget the exact reference. But that's another example of trying to bring women into American history in which they were arguably denied, either through the actual history where it was men, coming and deciding on the Constitution, white men, of course, and then even some of the interpretations of that past history has sometimes focused on only the white males as heroes and not bringing in persons of color and women and others into the discussion of who made the United States. And that goes back to Childish Gambino's text as well. So I had to really include this because I just had that chance to see Hamilton. I was blown away by it. It really moved me in so many different ways, but I was not at all expecting that intertextual moment to happen and that realization like, wow, there are so many interesting references going on in this musical. And so I think it's a good opportunity to really think about how musical forms can act as text and how they can refer to text, literal or musical and otherwise, as we make some of these considerations this week. We can take a peek this week at our additional readings and media. So these will give us a better sense of some of these contexts that we're discussing. So when we get to the focus on sound art, I encourage you to look at the Bloomsbury Handbook of Sound Art as well as this other article. We talk about music and therapy. There are quite a few different contexts you can consider. As usual, if this topic interests you, click on the readings and find one of the readings that is interesting and maybe use that for your focus for the text posts for this week. For example, this is talking about the therapeutic use of music and TV and neurocritical care. So check out any of those readings. When we get into altered states of consciousness, I have a few readings here that you can check out, so just be sure to look these over. And as usual, if any of these connect to your own experiences, feel free to include an example or feel free to include a link that might be to some form of multimedia that we can all share in this week in the class. Looking at the semiotics of music, there are a lot of different examples and contexts you can consider. So when you click on one of these readings, again, try to see if any of these contexts relate to your understandings of music. When we talk about the semiotics of music, we're really talking about applying symbolic principles or looking at symbols in the context of understanding music. And if you've taken classes in linguistics, then you'll be really on track in terms of understanding exactly what it is that we're considering here. As an example here, if you look at fetal heart sounds, you can apply what we call a material semiotic analysis to those sounds. So check any of these out, and if you like the context, write about these either in your text discussion for the week or your open discussion. Now, I wanted to give you some examples this week of sound art and my own experiences. So what I'll specifically be doing here is I'll be taking you through some examples of contexts in which I've worked with sound art experiments. So this first one is called Experimental Multimedia Studio. And I was very specifically trying to create small micro environments where I could explore different uses of sound, including my solenoid experiments. And I really saw this entire space that I created as a sound design space, as an installation, and not per se a performance space. Connected to this, and what I'll do is I'll play these three pieces through in their entirety. They're not too long. You'll get a better sense of how they work. What I wanted to do in this first experimental studio was to create a score and to really talk about it in the context of trying to visualize it and then have all these elements work together. So I talk about the foundations of it, and I've actually discussed this multimedia improvisation class I took at the University of Iowa in some previous lectures in this class. So I actually address it here. I discuss the intentions of the work, and then I get into building instructions, talking about how many of the devices I use here, including these devices here, these motor devices, all rely on a certain set of skills to create the instruments and to create the exact sounds. I also discussed some recording instructions, and then in the project sheet here, I was very interested in creating combinations of sounds at their timbral and rhythmic elements or levels. So for example, I was interested in how a particular surface like a spring might be struck with a particular striker, as I call it, and how a particular form of automation or machine used in the performance could help connect back to this performance. And then also various electronics were used to do everything from record the sound, automate it, alter it, change it in some interesting ways, and even provide chance operations to the sonic design of the performance. So that's the first experimental studio. And let me go ahead and play that for you now here in its entirety. Okay, that was the first of these 3 sonic installations that I'm talking about this week here. You heard that one. The next one is called Motor Event, and this one uses, as it's called, this particular motor, and I was interested in creating a sonic installation by having the motor hit the springs of one of my percussion boxes. And I wanted to really work on randomizing and altering the movement of this motor in some interesting senses. So as in the previous one, I talked a little bit about how I designed this particular performance installation using the motor and the spring box. Talked a little bit about the recording. Also discussed some of the influences and how I wanted to modulate this particular motor using some of the electronic opportunities available for me with my Eurorack synthesizer setup. And then I tried to create a diagram here that allowed me to understand all of the relationships in this piece between the spring box, the motor, and all the accoutrements, attachments to the motor, so that I would create these interesting effects as it hit the box. And then all the other sonic elements in this piece that were used to both randomize the movements of the motor hitting the spring on the box, and then apply other sonic channels to the particular performance in this piece. So let me play for you here a Motor Event to give you a sense of what I was trying to work with here. So again, what I was really interested in Motor Event was this idea of creating a miniature sonic installation. And on a larger scale, I think it could be very interesting to do some of these operations using a motor and some of these attachments to the motor. Because again, you're creating a sound that's really hard to create using other means. And thus, I really think of this more as a sonic installation than a performance space. And secondly, by using randomizations and generative elements that we'll be talking about more specifically in week 10, next week, I think it's an opportunity to really think about how you could design a sound installation setting such that people could interact with it and there could be different sonic ideas explored in the interaction between people and that particular space itself. The third one I'll play for you this week is another of these experimental multimedia studios, as I call them. And this is similar to my first one, but I really developed it. So in the time in which I wrote the first one in 2020, and during the time in which I wrote the second one in 2021, I really wanted to add new elements to the performance. And this one is actually in 4 different movements. And again, it involves the playing of some live instruments here, as you're seeing. So I talked about the foundation, very similar to the first version of it in 2020. I added more of the live instrument playing. I talked a little bit about the building instructions, and similarly to last time, the idea of a project sheet, which really got into an experimental studio, a space of experimentation, not unlike a laboratory in which you conduct scientific experiments. I also then wanted to think about how to create a score to notate the events happening in the space in such a way that if I like them, I could recreate them in future iterations or performances of this particular piece. So I created a score that focused on these elements or symbols: a device, a force, and a surface. And then I had various elements that included density, correlation, speed, conceptual core, character flow, among others. And these have more symbolic indicators. And this actually connects a little bit to the semiotics of music, and in particular, the idea of the signing systems or the symbolic systems that we use in our music notation to indicate certain things. In the case of experimental music, such as that happening in the 60s and onward, we understand that very often the score itself tries to divert or diverge from the traditional 12-tone system that we're familiar with, the traditional notational systems, tablature, whatever, and instead tries to do something more experimental. So this is where I'm trying to indicate some of this in the actual scores that I created. Moving through these then, you see for each of the 4 movements, I tried to notate the events as they happen in this experimental sonic space. This is the third one, in which I use a homemade gamelan, as you're seeing here, and a bunch of other different devices. This is another instance of it, trying to again indicate each of the events as they happen. So I actually saw this particular space as, again, a spatial design approach in which I could understand each of the various components of the space as they interacted with one another, almost like you would understand an installation in an art gallery that maybe had similar sonic and visual elements to it. And you're just seeing additional examples here of what this score looked like, and I even used the wind instrument in this particular piece. So let me now play for you the second version of Experimental Studio from 2021. So again, that was Experimental Studio from 2021, and what I was really trying to show you in all of these examples is how we could really think of sound art in a much different sense than we think of, say, sound in a performance hall setting. It's really more about the spatial aspects of the sound, including you could really think about how sound would interact with people as they move through a space. Again, these examples are not taking place in an art gallery, but other examples certainly remind me of this fact. But in an actual setting, say in a gallery, you could really think about how individuals would interact with sonic experiences or sonic moments in that space, and how the space could be designed in such a sense that sound could be coming from different dimensions, different angles, or different parts of the space. So sound art, I think, is a really great opportunity to explore many of the aspects of sound and music that we've been talking about throughout this class, but really focusing on the spatialization of music, as we'll talk about ending the quarter in week 10 and 11, talking more about everyday life contexts, including sound in our everyday lives, sound and sonic humanism, sound in brands, and sound even happening in urban spaces. So sound art is a great opportunity to think about the connection of the practical and spatial elements of sound and music, along with those conceptual and theoretical elements that we've focused on in a number of weeks of this class. Now, when we get into Music Plus, again, we might be talking about spoken word in the context of how spoken word performance often uses sonic dimensions, but using maybe more pure poetry and pure spoken word in albeit rhythmic senses. You can kind of look through here, and this also gets in some of the political uses of spoken word as an activist tool, and I think a pretty interesting article to look at. Beyond spoken word, you can look at the context of cinema and music, so look at part 2 of the Taylor book, and also this piece by Steffens, which is focused on film music and moral judgments. So some of those contexts could be interesting as well. Now, go back to our media inclusions for the week, for week 9. And as usual, click on any of these and watch them in the context of what you're trying to express in the discussions for this week. So if you're interested in sound art, I recommend these first 3 or 4 examples here on different uses of sound art. This piece on the sound of color I thought was pretty interesting when you get into synesthesia and this idea of one sense highlighting another sense, in this case color, and the visual perception, and sound or auditory culture. If you're interested in music therapy, there are 2 good videos that you can check out for this week, so watch both of those if you're interested. And if you want to learn more about musical semiotics, there's an example given here. And then these final 3 here really focus on different contexts, including film. And this case study from The Social Network I thought was pretty interesting because David Fincher's film, The Social Network, many thought was a great film. Many thought should have won the Academy Award that year. And one of the most curious scenes is the club scene, where the 2 individuals from the film, 2 of the leads, are talking to one another, and they're shouting on top of the music, and the music is making it hard for you to hear the dialogue. This scene was very divisive for many people who watched it. Some people thought it was just bad, and it was just too heavy-handed in terms of how Fincher used sound in this example, while others were saying it's actually very appropriate and it's a great aesthetic use of sound in film because it's showing you realistically, if you walked into a club, it would be hard for 2 people to hear one another on top of the music. Very interesting kind of consideration there. So you might look at this clip and ask yourself some questions about whether or not that was an effective use of sound in film. And very often film is a combination of moments of dialogue, sound design, Foley work, as we've talked about in previous weeks of this class, and then the ambient sounds that either are part of the character's environment that they're experiencing, in this case in The Social Network, or it's part of the soundtrack, which the characters are not directly hearing necessarily, but you're hearing as an audience member, and it allows you to create mood. The combination of all of those uses of sound refer to what we often call the sound design in film. So this is an excellent opportunity to really ask some conceptual questions about whether or not Fincher's use of sound in this case study of The Social Network was effective or not. So a lot to look at there. I encourage you to look at both the readings and the additional media for week 9. Now jumping back to our PowerPoint, again, when we're talking about music and plus this week, everything beyond music, we're talking about sound and other media and their interrelationships. So film, video, installations, including sound art, video games, spoken word, performance art, poetry, everyday life media. So think about this week as a context, everything that might connect to the use of sound and music beyond those two forms or media. Okay, so for this next section, I really want to talk about multimedia contexts and issues as they relate to music and sound. So very specifically here, I want to talk about film and scoring with multimedia. Now, if you have your own connection to film scores and film history, you might have your favorites out there. For me, some of the great soundtracks or soundtrack composers that come to mind are listed here. Bernard Herrmann with Hitchcock, Blade Runner, the Vangelis soundtrack, Interstellar with Hans Zimmer, so many different John Carpenter films, Escape from New York, Halloween, The Thing, so many other incredible musical connections that he made between film and his own music. And he's actually gone on tour with a small band as of late, playing some of his classics from his films. And what I like about John Carpenter is the simplicity of the form and also bringing in a lot of electronics. Hildur Guðnadóttir, I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly, but the incredible composer who has done work on the HBO series Chernobyl, also The Joker, which I didn't think was a great film because it riffs so much from Scorsese, but it certainly had, I thought, an incredible soundtrack. And then all the work that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross has done, not just from their Nine Inch Nails days, but from really working on these incredible soundtracks that blend a lot of experimental elements with traditional elements like piano music and so forth. So these are some of my favorites that I really enjoy when I'm listening to film. So I thought I'd show you a little bit here, some projects I've worked on or currently working on. One thing I want to talk about here is that a lot of contemporary music as realized in VSTs, these keyboard-driven, computer-driven sound sample libraries, often have a focus that really is emphasizing scoring. And to give you an example of that, we can have moments in films, of course, where we have almost like Foley sounds, where we hear a certain moment happening where you're leading to a dramatic situation. Someone is peering around a corner in a horror film or noir film, a dark thriller, and the sound helps you realize that sense of suspense and that mood as you're experiencing the what's happening filmically, visually. Just going to put the headphones on here. So this is an example of how this works. So you could imagine some moment on screen, and we can just pull up a video here to look at how this might appear. So just to demonstrate things, I have just some generic film loops here that do not necessarily matter, but just thinking about how we could create suspense perhaps. So we could imagine this playing. Let's see here. We'll just increase the size of that. Let's go ahead and play it. So it could be something, dramatic, and then a sound would happen. Maybe we would have a cue here when the ghost or whatever appears. Something like that. So I think what's kind of interesting is that a lot of the sample libraries of today are really emphasizing this kind of filmic approach. And this is why I really want us to consider the multimedia connections between music and sound, because I really feel like we're seeing now with a lot of sound libraries this emphasis on creating suspenseful risers or other examples of very iconic sounds that we might hear that really help us with the mood and help us with the viewing of what we're seeing on screen. Another example of that could be this thrill library, and these are very much horror-based sounds. So again, if we had a visual of some sort playing, and we want to create mood, and if you know music, if you know sound, what's kind of crazy and amazing is how good these libraries have become. And the fact that you have just a library here called Thrill that really only has a limited use, just as we talked about genres in music, we could talk about genres in film. I mean, I can't imagine using this in a romantic comedy or something unless you had a kind of a moment where something like that was being referenced from, say, film history, as we talked about today with references in Hamilton. So I find it pretty amazing that the libraries now are starting to really tailor themselves to soundtracks. Another example of that is the work of Heaviosity, and these are specifically giant sounding drums. Again, all of these are recorded in pristine labs, very high sampling rate, multi-sample of every possible note. You can actually adjust mic positions. So if you hear that, you could hear it's very close to me, but if you listen on headphones, you'll know what I'm talking about. And now we're moving away. And so just incredible sound. I mean, years ago, we didn't have this level of fidelity, this level of incredible creation of these drum kits, the sampling, the recording in pristine halls with the greatest equipment and the most amazing, audio to digital converters, and then all the software work and GUI design where you create the graphic user interface here for the instrument. So again, you could imagine this being used, and in particular, they have loops, and I would say that for some, loops are somewhat controversial because the feeling is like you're not doing anything because the loop is doing everything for you, which I think is a little unfair. I think loops have a role certainly in all of our music. When I was discussing Hamilton earlier, I didn't mention the fact that indeed there was actually use of Ableton Live for some of the drum sounds, so it was a very complex musical performance that combined live musicians with some pre-programmed beats. So here, these are examples of loops you could use in cinematic contexts. And you kind of get the idea. Again, incredible sounding. And so what you could do is if you were scoring a film, you could use these elements, obviously combine them with others, and I think have some really interesting opportunities to create a soundtrack that is sounds very live and very authentic. These drums playing here remind me of the work of Junkie XL, the famous DJ and composer of so many film soundtracks, also does incredible work. Mad Max is one that comes to mind, the reboot of Mad Max. Now, another one I've mentioned to you in the past is the Bernard Herrmann Orchestra, and you'll note that I mentioned Bernard Herrmann is one of my favorite film composers, and did all the Hitchcock films, did Citizen Kane, just super amazing. And what was really key with Bernard Herrmann was the sense of presence that he created with the orchestra, specifically how he mic'd it on a soundstage. And so Spitfire Audio, that does really high-end VSTs or virtual synths, created this Bernard Herrmann Orchestra Composer Toolkit some years back, and I had to pick it up because the sound was so phenomenal and amazing. And so what's cool about this is you can kind of create that Hitchcock sound that you might have heard in Vertigo or other films by using this orchestra. Has such presence, and what I really like about it is the fact that you can choose from a far microphone placement, and it takes a while for the computer to get caught up. Again, moving between these different mic placements means that all the recording, all the multi-sampling had to happen, and a lot of these libraries in today's day and age could have 60, 70,000 different samples or more. So now it's far away from us, and let's make it really close and give it that Hitchcockian presence that you hear in some of those films. And it's going to catch up again here. It takes a while. And now it should be closer. And so you hear it's closer to us. So one of the things that I think it's very intriguing in doing film scoring and sonic design for film is that you're thinking about spatial placement of the audio, how this relates to scenes in the film, to creating atmosphere, mood, and so forth. Also, the fact that you have to bring in Foley elements, not just like those risers that I played earlier, but sound effects and different things happening on screen. So that has to be mixed with the music, also with the dialogue of the characters. As I mentioned this week with the situation that we saw in The Social Network, David Fincher's film, I think that's a very controversial moment in sound design history and film because of the fact that the dialogue of the actors really is drowned out by the music in the club, which of course is intentional and trying to give you a sense of that mood of what it would be like sonically if we were in a club. Now, not all films do that, and there are many moments where, of course, what's happening sonically on film might not even relate to the actual atmospheric sound that the actors would experience in the moments in which they're acting. So there's a lot of opportunities certainly for avant-garde exploration of ideas when you're thinking about connecting sound with moving image. Now, this symphonic destruction is something I wanted to show you here, and very specifically, this is a new library from Heaviosity that did that big drum library. And so I've been working with a friend on a small independent film, and I just wanted to show you some of this as an example. This is not from the actual film. I don't have rights to use it, but I am working on it currently. So I wanted to show you this because, again, I think there's an interesting moment where you realize when you're doing something like film scoring, creating sound effects, creating a sound design, where you have one idea going into it with some themes and motifs. But then as you watch the visuals and as the director and the editors and the actors express their notions in creating what they're creating on screen, you start to adapt what you're doing. In my case, it really was pulling things back and simplifying what I was working on. So again, I could take one of these sounds and I'm going to actually find a better one here. So what's very interesting is you could hear a lot of these sounds. If, again, you listen in headphones, we have these macros going that are creating panning that is linked to the envelope, the filter, and in this case, the drive of the sound. So you get this incredible sonic experience as you're hearing movement through your headphones. What Apple has been doing lately with some of their new approaches to sonic design and sonic opportunities for music and for apps is really pushing this forward where we're thinking maybe more spatially about multiphonic or quadraphonic, whatever you want to call it, spatial design that if you're listening in headphones can be incredibly evocative. So what's very interesting about this library is the fact that a lot of the stuff available here almost has, like I've been talking about earlier, a pre-made nature to it. And again, for some, I think this will be controversial, but I see this as an opportunity to use some of these to create some moods. Just trying to find some here. So again, hearing a sound like this, it might convey something to you, and then you could go back to whatever you're working on visually and play along with it. So I would almost see these as starting points. What I like to do if I'm watching something visually, and I'll show you some other examples later of my own film work I've done with much simpler visuals than this film I'm working on that has a whole crew and people working on the editing and the color grading and everything else. But if I'm doing something on my own, I typically would start with a motif or I would start with a particular sound and then build on that. In some cases, I could have, using my program, Logic Pro, I could have maybe each of these as a track here. I might have 30 different tracks, and then it becomes really thinking about mixing. The thing I didn't count on working on this particular film is the stuff I've done in the past doesn't have dialogue. Might have some computer-generated sounds and some vocals, but not dialogue per se. So it's been really challenging for me to think about this because I'm not used to this idea of trying to make your music work in conjunction with the vocals, if you will, what the actors are speaking and doing on screen. Now, this is called a bram, so this is almost like onomatopoeia. It's that sound like bram that we hear in a big Hans Zimmer score, like in Interstellar. So this library was created with that sort of genre or style in mind. So these are all super big hits. And actually something similar to this sound here. So one of the scenes I was working on, just going to bring in a second film sample. Again, these aren't the real samples from the film. I'm just trying to give you a sense of, simulating what this might look like. So one of the scenes in the film that my friend is, again, creating has this drone shot, and he's an incredible drone filmmaker. He was one of the first persons, I think, to get some sort of license for drone flying in the nation. I heard about this on his social media. So in this particular shot, he has a drone and it's following a car. And I think it's fairly stationary in the perspective, but you see the car kind of winding through the woods, and eventually there's a scene where there's a body, and it's kind of this foreboding, foreshadowing of what's going to happen later in the film. So you hear something like, or you see something like this on screen. It's much darker and much better than this sample. So I started to think like, what would sound good with that scene? What would I put there to create a particular mood, knowing, as we talked about the text this week, the text of the story, having seen the film and read the script. In the original sonic design he had with some stock samples, it was kind of like that thrill library I played for you was more spooky and kind of ethereal and atonal. I thought of a very simple motif similar to this. And it's very slow. It's that one hit. And a pause of a few seconds in between. And they're fairly rhythmically predictable. Because for me, it creates a little more suspense when they have sort of equidistance from each other in terms of the beat. And so that just kind of plays over and over. And the filmmaker and some of the actors ended up liking it and said, that really works for that particular scene. What was amazing about it was really, it was one sound that I tweaked a little bit. So I went in and I adjusted the reverb, the distortion, a little bit of the presence of how that sounded, at least in headphones. And one thing, by the way, that you get into if you're doing any musical or audio production is, how do you monitor your sound? Do you monitor sound on good speakers? Do you monitor on headphones? What kind of headphones? What kind of speakers? What's your budget? I've had friends that have had small studios, and they'll set up an array of different speakers, including some really cheap speakers, like some speakers you put in a car that are very tinny and very trebly and don't sound great, because they want to get a wide range of the mix sounding on different experiences. One of the challenges thinking about film scoring or any kind of sonic work is, will people be listening through headphones? Will they listen through earbuds? Will they listen on their computer speakers? Will they listen on a TV? Will they listen on monitors? That's really hard because nowadays we have so many different opportunities for our sonic enjoyment that sometimes you drive yourself nuts thinking about the mastering side of things. And there's a whole AI side of this, as we've been talking about, that I've thought about seriously, because I really struggle with mastering when I have all my tracks in a particular song in Logic Pro. I sometimes really struggle with that moment of trying to figure out how best to mix the parts, and then think about, again, monitoring either through headphones or through speakers. So it's definitely a real challenge when you get into this issue of thinking about the sound design. So again, that's just a little bit talking about some of this film experience. What I'd encourage you to do this week is to really think critically when you look at film. think about, again, your favorite examples, like some of mine here, and think about what it is that happens in the context of watching a film, hearing the sound, hearing the audio, hearing the Foley, the sound effects, the soundtrack, the musical score, the actors, and all of that combined in one package. It's really amazing to think about just the level of production and composition and performance that has to happen when you're putting something like this together for someone to listen to in a film. So I just mentioned there then working on this film project, which involved obviously video or film that I didn't actually produce. I want to show you some additional examples of that this week. So one of these is called The Modern World, and this one I'll just link to. It's super long, but I was really interested in creating a composition with visuals that would really focus on kind of the ills of consumer society. So as you watch this, realize that every single clip here is from a place called Storyblocks that offers royalty-free clips. So none of the video clips I have here I shot on my own. What I did was I edited them together and then added the music. And one of the things I like to do when I'm editing something like this is to actually bring in my audio tracks. I don't have a good example of this, I think, here. Actually, this is one here. So what I tried to do is I'll bring my video in, and then I have the audio files that go along with the video clip. So as I'm working on this, I can go in and make adjustments both to the video and the audio at the same time. So I actually like mixing my audio, strangely enough, inside my video editor, because I feel like I can really work on that interrelationship between the visuals and also then the audio that is being heard going along with the film or the video. So that's kind of one thing that I do, is I work as much as possible simultaneously so I can create that relationship. If it's stuff I've shot on my own, it's much easier to work with. If it's someone else's visuals, I really have to think about their interpretation. And what I told this filmmaker in working on this project is, I said, you know, it's your vision and it's the vision of the others involved. I will give you, in the case of, there's one scene where there's a woman walking down a hallway, I provided a series of 13 different audio clips. I think I can show you a sample of that here. So this is an example for that film I was describing to you. So I said, I'm going to give you these 12 different samples of audio, and you can decide which will work best. And they all sound different from like a sonic design standpoint. Second one here. And this particular scene is one that's very kind of mysterious and involving the character walking down a hallway, opening a series of doors. And this particular story has a lot of family trauma connected, so there's a dark history there that's being uncovered and unraveled for the viewer. So I, again, created sounds that I thought all fit, but had different sonic characters. So this one has that high frequency noise going on, which I really like. And there's also a lot of panning, and there's this kind of ethereal sound, almost of a voice that you hear moving around. And some of this is happening through manipulation on the keyboard of some of the patches I'm using here. And this one is the same of that last version, but less hiss. So I just took EQ and I took out the high bands, the high frequencies. And I actually like the previous one because, I don't know, I just maybe don't expect in some scenes to hear that level of hiss, which I think has an interesting presence to it. And these are all different. This has a more orchestral kind of sound to it. So what I'm trying to suggest there too is that if I'm working on a film, I try to really give the filmmaker opportunities. Here's the mood, given what you told me, what I see happening on screen, my own interpretations, my own work as a sound designer, a writer of music, and so forth. Here's what I interpret from those scenes, but I'm going to give you 5 versions or even 12 versions because I don't entirely know. I want you to choose the one that fits in best. So I'll really try to do that if it's someone else's footage. Now, I'm including this week 2 pieces in there, mostly in their entirety. The second one's kind of long. This is one where I had a more upbeat electronic song called Electroworld 2, and I wanted to, again, use these stock video clips along with the action on the screen.
And no one could ever agree on that.
I really enjoyed working on. And so actually, let me play this one for you now, called Electroworld 2. And you're going to note that what I did was I took the stock clips and I added some filters to it to kind of give it that kind of that look from like a rotoscope from the film Waking Life. It's kind of an effect similar to that. So let me play that for you now.
Yes, since you had asked me, I was very curious to begin to understand the nature of the sounds being developed. I wasn't sure at first, but it seemed to me that the oscillators would be just fine. However, the levels of synthesis were not quite right, I do think. Aha, who is to say what the nature of sound should be? Is this something that meets your ear's fancy? The problem was, well, it's hard to describe, but let's just say that the sound engineers did not agree with the sequences of the music and vice versa. We had encountered, so it had seemed, a gap between the sound design and the sequencing. And then there was the rhythm. Oh, 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 and no one could ever agree on that. No. Come to think of it, there was something funky and off about it. I might even say disharmonious, but who is counting? It just didn't work. The timbre, the range of sounds, the sensibility of meter, the emphasis of the beats, the overall aesthetics of it all. Everything seemed to be in another world, and there was no communication among the parts. A symphony without a conductor, a quartet with 3 players, a jazz band with no drummer. I could go on forever, but let me pause. So, as we get started, could you please detail for me your preferences in terms of the following: acid bass, wicked rhythm synth, in-your-face kick drum, relentless tinny snare, syncopation, electro hi-hats, mild synth pad, tasty high strings, low-end augmentation, pressuring off the wall grunge bass, compressed electric guitar, simple wood block, polyrhythmic voice, a clanging, something that sounds like a wind instrument, a sine wave that resonates, classic slap bass, an electric piano, something like a crunch guitar, general low end, or the upper harmonics, the sound of metals clanging, lots of saxophone, what seems to sound like marine life, or the staccatos of drums, the sense of screeching, clout. Hammond, Tibetan-influenced sound design, African percussion, old school or new school, a hip hop aesthetic, something more or less like Elvis. Leslie simulation or surround sound, the pulsing deep pedal you hear in the movies, sounds of birds chirping in the afternoon, a series of sound effects, or something entirely different. Or just some silence.
So as you can see there, what I was trying to do really was to convey mood from the song and then linking images to it. In the case of doing this film work for my independent filmmaker friend, it's the opposite. So for me that's a little different too, because I'm usually used to starting with the music first and then adding some of the visualization second, not starting with the visuals and then adding the music. Now this next one, I'll show you a little clip of it. It's called Homo Sacer Part 2. So what I was trying to do with that actually was, so this I shot on my own. I have these miniatures that I found, and I very specifically bought these miniatures because the reviews online said that they were poorly painted. I have a macro lens with my camera, the same Blackmagic camera, so I used a turntable and a light box, and I did a lot really to set the lighting up, and then I just had these figures, these miniature figures, rotating slowly, and over time I zoom in on the figures, and one of the things I wanted was to really pick up on the imperfections again in the painting, as you see here, as I kind of zoom in a little bit. And as this is rotating, it has a particular feel or a particular movement to it. So when I created this series with these miniatures, I really started with the visuals. I knew I wanted to use these miniature figures, the turntable effect, the black background. I also added in some fake moss here I bought for like basically train sets. You can buy fake grass and fake ground that kind of gives this effect too, with the figures sitting on top of it. So for me, I had an idea in mind. I executed it visually. Once I had the video, then I started doing the composition of the music. So it's interesting actually from a process standpoint, thinking about moving from those two angles. One is starting with the visuals, then doing the sound. The other is starting with the sound, then adding the visuals. There probably is as well some in between there, but for me, it's an interesting process to think about as I'm going into these considerations, trying to look at the interrelationship of sound, music, and film or video on screen. And certainly I would say that as we've considered this week some of the relationships between film, the moving image, and video, and sound and music, that you certainly should link music and sound to all these other contexts as well. So as appropriate, if you think about your own experiences, say with performance art, or theater, or musicals, video games, bring in those to our conversations as we talk about the idea of this music plus, basically music interfacing with other media forms out there in the world, opportunities really to think about the interrelationships between those forms and sound and music. So that is going to do it this week for our Week 9 lecture. Hopefully you have a lot of stimulating ideas to consider this week between the media, the readings, and some of the context I've given you here as well. As always, feel free to incorporate your own multimedia examples or even performances or sonic experiments as they might be appropriate to our class, particularly in that open discussion section. Also want to remind you that projects are coming up, so it's a good time to really kind of look at the home stretch as we're in Week 9, moving into 10, 11, and finals. It's really the time to start honing in on the projects and making sure that you're perfecting them. Again, just really want to emphasize that projects are going to be graded on a merit-based scale. They're not pass-fail. So if you don't turn in the work, if you don't do the appropriate level of work, unfortunately, probably will bring your grade down in the class below a C just because that project is worth so many points in this class. So reach out if you have any questions about projects. Stop into office hours, talk to me on Canvas in the inbox so we can talk about your project and its evolution. So thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with our Week 10 lecture.